Let's have a look at how we can turn our flat 2D designs into something that looks a little bit more interesting. We're going to start by changing the composition resolution. And then I'm going to add in a background shape. Go into the fill settings and add a gradient shader. I'm going to set the rotation to 90 degrees. And then these black and white colors, that's usually something you want to change. I've set up a color palette here that I want to use for this video. So I'm going to drag this color in and click on my white color and drag this color in. Now I'm going to create a circle. So just hold down Shift when you're drawing. Otherwise you'll create an ellipse. And go into the color settings here. And we're going to use this pinkish color for now. Finally, I want to add a border to my design. So another background shape, disable the fill, enable the stroke, go into the width, increase the width, and also change the color. So this is my basic design. Now let's make some changes to improve the visuals. I'm going to start with the circle, and I'm going to go into the Shape tab and use a filter. And we're going to start with an inner shadow. The inner shadow is a shadow that starts at the border. We can hold down Alt and increase the blur size. And we can change the offset. And when we change the offset, we get feeling that there's light coming from a certain direction. So I would try to get at least some of it fully in the shadow. So you have some contrast between light and shadow. And then instead of using a black color, which of course is perfectly fine if that's what you want, I'm going to use this darker pink here. And just to create a little bit more contrast, I'm going to go into the circle and change this color to a lighter pink. So there's more difference between light and dark. And this already gives us a pretty nice look, but it still looks a little bit flat. So one thing we can do is we can add another inner shadow to add some rim light. So let's go to my second inner shadow, change this to white. And now you see that we have a simple rim light, so a light coming from the rear. We can change the offset a little bit so that there's more light coming from the upper left corner. But of course not too much, because then you lose the rim light on the bottom. There we go. And this 100% white rim light is a little bit too much, so I'm going to change it maybe to something around 50%. That looks good. So now we have a nice lighting setup, but the circle still feels very perfect. And this is common with computer-generated graphics. You get these perfect lines, this perfect shading. Now, if that's something you want, if you're doing something a little bit more abstract, that's perfectly fine. I'm going to show you how we can get rid of that look. Let's go into our ellipse shape again. And again, go to filters. And this time we're going to use the distort edges feature. And this, as the name suggests, is going to distort the edges of our circle. And the default settings are pretty nice. We get some subtle distortion. I'm going to increase the amplitude so you can see it a little bit better. This would be too much, but just to show what the effect is doing. The distortion is driven by a noise shader in this tab. And one thing to note is that the time is animated by default. So if I hit play, you're going to see this move along. That could be a cool effect, but if you don't want that, just remove the animation. And now everything is static. We can change the scale here. So, for example, like this, if you want a more fluffy, smaller effect. And if we go back to our filter and change the amplitude back to something like 20, 15 maybe. This looks nice. So I'm going to set this a little bit lower. Now we get this subtle distortion. We got rid of that perfect circle look, but we still have this perfect shading in the center. So what we want to do is we want to add a little bit of texture, a little bit of irregularity, and that's going to help to remove that perfect shading look. I'm going to go into my ellipse settings, and I'm going to go into the fill settings. We have this static color here. I'm going to add a noise shader. By default, this looks very ugly, so let's go into the noise shader settings. Again, we have the time, so this is going to animate. You don't want that. Remove the animation here. We have the blend mode, which is very important. So at the moment, we're not blending at all. We're just using the noise shader. We can use the alpha to blend in, but we still get that white and black look, which isn't really attractive. So I'm going to change this to a color burn. Now the color burn by default looks very extreme, and that's because of the values that are very dark here, so the dark grays and blacks that are really burning this area of the color. We can change the darker colors by increasing the minimum. So once we reach 1, we're just seeing a white color and there's no effect anymore. So you want to go a little bit below 1. This will be too much, but it's just to demonstrate what the effect is doing. We can change the scale. So if you want a rougher look or a larger effect, that's all possible. So I'm going to increase the minimum to something like 0.7, 0.8. And it might not be very obvious what's happening, but when we disable the noise, you see that the difference is actually pretty big. And this is one of those things that you generally don't want to overdo, because when you overdo it, you clearly see the noise pattern and it's distracting. When you do it in a subtle way, it adds a little bit of texture without being too much in your face. Now let's go into our edge here. So the border that we added, we can change the perfect edge here as well in the exact same way. So I'm going to go to my filters, distort edges. And again, keep in mind that the shader is animated, which might look nice, but if you don't want that, turn it off. And that already gives us a very different look from the start. Now let's add a bit of post-processing. I'm going to add another background shape, and I'm actually going to leave it here on the top. So at the moment, it completely blocks everything we want to see. But we can go into the fill settings, set this to white, and then go into the blend mode and set this to color burn again. So the color burn, as we saw before, it's just burning those darker areas. So when the fill color is white, nothing is happening. Now I'm going to add in a vignette. And this vignette, I can show this if I just go to the normal blend mode again. A vignette is basically a soft circle that gets darker near the edges. So when we decrease the feather, you can clearly see that. Let's leave the feather around the value it was. And let's go back to our background shader and set this back to color burn. And now when we go back into our vignette, we can change the alpha value. At the moment, this effect is very strong. Corners are becoming completely dark. By changing this alpha, we can make the effect more subtle. So 0, of course, means no effect. So have a look and see what you like. And one of the cool things about adding a post-processing layer like this is that it affects everything. So it's working on everything underneath. And when I move my ellipse, for example, closer to the corner, you see that the color burn and the vignette are making these pink colors a little bit more saturated, a little bit more interesting. So that's a neat bonus of using this kind of post-processing instead of applying the effect to the background gradient, for example. You will also see that the vignetting effect is affecting our border here. And that's really the goal of post-processing, is that you get a look that applies to your entire scene and not just individual elements. Another example of what we can do with post-processing would be to add some film grain. Let's go into the background shape and add in a grain filter. And I'm going to increase the strength here for a moment so it's obvious what's happening. So this is your film grain. The grain can add a little bit of texture to your look. It can also help with compression, especially when you're using very subtle gradients. Adding a little bit of grain can make it a little bit easier to avoid compression artifacts. Grain is animated by default. That's usually something you would want to keep in, but you can disable it if you want here. And I'm going to use the highlights here because we're still working on our background shape, which is white. So we're only getting grain in the highlights. And I'm going to set this to maybe 0.5, something around there. And that gives us a subtle grain look, not too much, but it's still noticeable when we disable it. That's it. If you would like to see more Cavalry tutorials like this in the future, please subscribe or let me know in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one.